The search area has expanded on an hourly basis, and the methods being deployed are also changing. Originally, there were 2 search and rescue helicopters. Now there are 3, and rescue workers have deployed 5 drones.
The Anderson family, known for their sense of adventure and tight-knit bond, set off on their yearly holiday, this time to the thick jungles of South America. They shared cheerful photos during the first few days, but then suddenly all contact stopped. No more posts, no calls, nothing. For 5 long years, their disappearance became a haunting mystery to everyone who knew them. Then, out of nowhere, Sophie Anderson, the youngest of the 3 kids, returned. She was alone, exhausted, and carrying a story no one was ready for. A story that would change everything we thought we knew. The Andersons were the kind of family people looked up to. Robert and Emily, both in their mid-40s, were not just devoted parents. They were explorers at heart. Their kids, Lucas, 16, Mia, 12, and Sophie, 8, had grown up hearing amazing stories about far-off places, passed down from their parents' travels. Every year, the family picked a new place to explore together. In 2018, they set their sights on the Amazon rainforest in South America, one of their most daring trips yet. In the weeks before the trip, their excitement was obvious. Their social media was filled with updates, Robert studying maps at the kitchen table, Emily carefully organizing gear, and the kids laughing as they broke in their hiking boots. They planned to share their journey every step of the way, keeping friends and relatives updated through photos and stories from the trail. And at first, that's exactly what they did. The first few days were full of colorful pictures and wide-eyed captions. There were shots of squawking parrots, towering trees, and winding river rides. One post showed Lucas next to a massive tree with a caption that read, "Nature like we've never seen before." But then all of it stopped. No warning, no explanation. At first, no one panicked. Cell service was bound to be spotty out there, but when a whole day passed with no word, then 2, then 3, people started to worry. The Andersons had always made a point to check in daily, and this silence felt strange. By the end of the week, their extended family reported them missing. Search efforts started immediately. Local authorities organized teams to search the area where the Andersons were last known to be. Helicopters swept over the trees while boats combed the winding rivers. Even the U.S. Embassy stepped in, working with local officials to broaden the search. But the Amazon is massive and unforgiving. Days turned to weeks. Every new lead disappeared into the jungle. And slowly, hope began to fade. The last place the Andersons had been seen was a small eco-lodge near the edge of a protected jungle zone. People at the lodge remembered them heading out on a guided tour, but no one could say they ever came back. Even the guide, a well-known local with years of experience, had vanished. As the months passed and leads dried up, the search slowly lost steam. The sheer size and thickness of the rainforest made progress nearly impossible. Eventually, the search was called off. Authorities expressed sympathy, but most quietly accepted what many feared. The Andersons had likely been lost to the jungle. Their case became just one more mystery buried deep in the Amazon. 5 years later, on what began as an ordinary morning at the American Embassy in Manaus, Brazil, everything changed. A call came in from a local official near the jungle. Someone had shown up at a remote outpost. A young girl. She was thin, dirty, and clearly exhausted. She said her name was Sophie Anderson. Her English was broken, her words unsure. But if it was true, this girl had somehow survived all these years. Sophie was brought straight to the embassy. Her clothes were torn and worn down, and her hair looked like it had been cut with a knife. Staff quickly checked her identity using old photos and documents. There was no doubt. This was Sophie, the youngest of the Anderson kids. She was alive, alone, but alive. And with her return came an avalanche of questions. Where had she been? How had she survived? And what about the rest of her family? News of Sophie's reappearance spread fast. Back in the U.S., her cousin Francesca and her grandfather Mark caught the next flight to Brazil. When they arrived, they were stunned by what they saw. Sophie was no longer the bubbly 8-year-old they'd last seen. Her face looked thinner, her eyes distant and wary, like she was still stuck in survival mode. She didn't run to them, she stood still, unsure, until her eyes met her grandfather's. Her lip trembled. Then suddenly, she rushed toward him. "Grandpa," she whispered, before throwing her arms around him and holding on tight, like she couldn't bear to let go. Even though her speech was slow and uncertain, Sophie was able to share fragments of her experience. She talked about people who had helped her. When she spoke about her family, it was always in the present tense. "They're still there," she said softly, "but they're sick. I came for help." Her words shook both Francesca and Mark to the core. Could the rest of the Andersons really still be alive? And if they were, where had they been all this time? And what had they gone through to survive? Sophie finally got some rest that night, but Mark and Francesca couldn't sleep. They sat quietly going over the little they'd learned. Sophie's scattered memories hinted at something incredible. Years of survival in the heart of the jungle. But there were still so many blank spaces in her story. Each answer only raised more questions. At first light, the three of them, Sophie, Francesca, and Mark, began their journey back into the jungle. They started from a tiny riverside village, joined by a local guide who knew the terrain. Surprisingly, it was Sophie who led the way. With a machete in hand, she walked confidently ahead of them. The thick forest didn't seem to bother her at all. She moved like she belonged there, her feet finding paths no one else could see. Francesca and Mark struggled to keep pace, weighed down by the sticky heat and the dense air. Sophie, though, looked like she was walking through her own backyard. As they pushed deeper into the jungle, signs of the past began to show. Bits of torn fabric clung to branches, and a rusty cooking pot lay half buried in the dirt. Francesca picked it up, turning it in her hands. "This was theirs," she said softly, glancing over at Mark. "They really were here." Sophie didn't say anything. She just kept moving, focused and quiet, like she knew exactly where she was going. The further they walked, the darker the forest became. The canopy above them thickened until barely any light got through. The sounds around them shifted. Birds called louder, and the rustle of unseen animals felt closer. As night fell, they stopped in a small clearing and made camp. Mark tried to sleep, but he couldn't shut off his thoughts. How had Sophie managed to survive here alone? What had happened to the others? Francesca tossed and turned, just as restless. Later that night, Sophie suddenly stood and walked to the edge of the clearing. Francesca followed, curious. Sophie was staring into the shadows beyond the trees. "We're close," she said quietly. "They're waiting." At dawn, they packed up and followed Sophie deeper into the jungle. The brush slowly cleared into a narrow trail that wound sharply left and right. Sophie moved with purpose, not hesitating for a moment. Then she stopped and pointed ahead. "There," she whispered. Through the trees, Francesca and Mark could just make out a small village. Simple huts made of wood and woven leaves stood in a wide circle around a fire pit in the middle. Smoke drifted gently up into the sky. The place looked untouched by time, hidden from the outside world. As they stepped into the village, people began to appear from the huts. They looked curious but calm. Sophie greeted them, speaking in a mix of gestures and words neither Mark nor Francesca could understand. What stunned them most wasn't the village. It was how comfortable Sophie was in it, like she'd been part of this world for years. The moment the Anderson family came into view, everything seemed to freeze. Robert and Emily sat quietly outside one of the small huts. They looked nothing like their old selves. Thin, worn down, their skin darkened and rough from years in the sun. Lucas and Mia sat nearby, looking just as fragile. Mark's eyes filled with tears at the sight. "Emily!" "Robert," he called out, voice cracking. Robert looked up slowly, his eyes locked on Mark's face. "Mark?" he said, his voice raspy and weak. Francesca didn't wait. She rushed forward and wrapped her arms around Lucas and Mia. It was a reunion filled with emotion, relief and joy mixed with the heavy truth of what these years had done to them. Sophie stood a few steps away, quiet, just watching as her family came together again. Once the shock of the moment settled, Mark and Francesca began to really see where they were. The village was tiny and clearly far from anything modern. The people here lived off the land with quiet skill. They grew small gardens, fished nearby rivers, and gathered herbs for healing. In her slow, careful English, Sophie explained that the villagers had found the Andersons years ago. They had been weak, injured, and lost, and the villagers had saved them. "They saved us," Robert said softly. "We'd never have made it on our own." But it was clear something was wrong. Robert's breathing was shallow. Emily kept coughing. Lucas and Mia were pale and sluggish. Even the villagers looked unwell. Their eyes were tired, their movements slow, and some had red rashes on their arms. "What's going on?" Francesca asked gently. Sophie looked down. "A sickness," she said. "It started a few months ago. Everyone's getting sick, even my family." She paused. "The village has medicine, but it's not enough. They don't have what they need." Mark's chest tightened. The situation was worse than they'd thought. Without proper medical care, things could spiral fast. But they were in the middle of the jungle. Getting help wouldn't be easy. He and Francesca spoke quietly with the Andersons and later with the village elders, who listened politely but hesitated. "They're scared," Emily explained. "They've lived here so long, away from everything. They don't trust outsiders." As night fell and the stars came out, the conversation continued. Sophie helped guide the discussion, translating and explaining both sides. The elders respected her. She'd grown up here, knew their ways, and they trusted her. Slowly, with patience, they agreed to allow a small group of outsiders to come. Just enough to bring medicine and help without overwhelming the village. That night, the jungle hummed around them as the fire flickered. Sophie sat beside Francesca and Mark near one of the huts. Her family was inside, resting. Francesca leaned in gently. "Sophie," she said, "can you tell us what happened after you disappeared?" Sophie looked at the fire for a long moment before speaking. We got lost," she began. "The guide said he knew a shortcut, a new path. But then a storm hit. The rivers flooded, trees fell. We couldn't find our way back. Everything around us just closed in." Sophie continued her story, her voice low and steady. She explained that after the storm, the guide started to panic. He told them he knew another route, one that would take them to safety, but it only led them deeper into the jungle. Their food began to run out, and every day became harder than the last. They couldn't tell how long they'd been walking. The jungle twisted everything, and their maps became useless. "We were scared," Sophie said quietly, "but Mom and Dad kept saying we'd be okay, that we'd get out somehow. But then, everything changed. One night, without warning, the guide disappeared. No note, no goodbye. Whether he got lost, gave up, or didn't survive, Sophie never found out. Left completely alone, the family pressed on, moving forward simply because they had no other choice. Eventually, they stumbled upon the village. "They found us," Sophie said, the villagers. "They didn't speak English, but they helped us, gave us food, water, a place to rest." At first, the Andersons didn't know what to think. They were exhausted and cautious, unsure if the village was safe. But time passed, and it became clear the villagers meant no harm. They had taken the family in when they were at their lowest. Slowly, the Andersons began to adapt. They learned to live the way the villagers did, fishing with handmade nets, gathering wild fruit, using leaves and roots as medicine. It wasn't easy, Sophie added. Dad hurt his leg not long after we got there. Mom got sick from the river water, but we figured things out. We didn't have a choice. The years slipped by. Sophie's English faded as she picked up the local language. Lucas and Mia became strong and quick, able to climb trees and catch fish with ease. Emily and Robert helped however they could, tending gardens, collecting wood, learning what the village taught them. Deep down, they all still hoped to go home. But as time dragged on, they came to accept that no one was coming. Rescue felt like a distant dream. Then the sickness hit. Sophie described it in simple, painful detail. It started slowly, just a few coughs, some tired days. But soon, nearly everyone in the village had it. Fever, weakness, and breathlessness took hold, even among the strongest. Her own family wasn't spared. Emily weakened day by day, barely able to get out of bed. Lucas and Mia could hardly stand. Robert's breathing grew shallow, and he could no longer hide how hard it was for him to move. Sophie's eyes glistened in the firelight as she looked over at the hut where her family lay resting. "I didn't know what else to do," she said softly, "so I left. I went to find help. I couldn't watch them get worse," Sophie said quietly. "I knew I had to do something." Even though the villagers begged her not to go, Sophie made up her mind. She spent weeks getting ready, gathering what little food she could, studying the barely visible trails that might lead her out. "I didn't know if I'd make it," she said, looking down, "but I couldn't stay and just watch." Later that night, as the fire crackled softly in the center of the village, Lucas slowly stepped out of his hut. He walked over to where Francesca and Mark sat. His steps were slow, his face pale. He looked at Sophie, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. Lucas took a breath and leaned in close. "There's something Sophie didn't tell you," he said in a low voice. "The sickness, it's not just something going around. It's the water. Something's in it." Francesca and Mark looked at each other, alarmed. Lucas hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Before Sophie came back, she found signs of mining upstream. Big machines, barrels of chemicals, people dumping stuff into the river. That's our water source. Sophie reached into her worn bag and pulled out a small, rusted metal tag. It had a strange logo on it, something none of them recognized. "I found this near the site," she said. "It's poisoning the river." The villagers, our family, even the trees, it's all being affected. The next few days moved fast. With the elders' cautious blessing, Francesca and Mark contacted local officials and international aid groups. Word spread quickly. Helicopters soon arrived, carrying doctors and nurses, clean water, and medicine. The sick were treated, and for the first time in months, hope began to return to the village. Mark didn't stop there. He reached out to environmental organizations, armed with Sophie's photos and the metal tag. News outlets picked up the story. What started as a quiet search for a missing family turned into something much bigger, a warning about what can happen when hidden places are exploited and forgotten. The Andersons' survival and Sophie's courage became headline news. Activists, journalists, and aid workers came together to bring attention to what was happening in this remote corner of the world. But more importantly, they took action to stop it. In the end, Sophie's decision to walk out of the jungle didn't just save her family, it sparked something larger. Her bravery became more than just part of a survival story. It became a reason for the world to pay attention. Would you be able to survive deep in the Amazon, like Sophie and her family? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. If you were moved by this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real-life mysteries and incredible journeys. Until next time,